Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everybody to the data sharing and preservation session. We're having some technical issues. The Wi-Fi is pretty unstable, so I hope everything will work fine with the interactive part and the polls and so on. So please apologize us before when things go wrong. Let me share my screen. Okay, so far so good. I'm using a hotspot as well, so. So I'm very glad with the big turnout, so welcome to the session. We're going to start with some introductory presentations. First, we're going to introduce Federation in the context of EOSC and how long-term preservation fits into this. This is from the perspective of the Long-Term Data Preservation Task Force of the EOSC Association. And I'm joined today with my colleague Hervé Loers. He's Repository and Preservation Manager at the UK Data Archive, and he's my co-chair in the Long-Term Data Preservation Task Force. I myself am Roxanne Wins. I'm Innovation Manager at KU Leuven, which is a university in Leuven, Belgium, Flanders. So yeah, I'm also the co-chair. The second presentation will be by Karel Presser. And luck is really on our side because he has COVID and he's in his hotel room, also using his hotspot because the Wi-Fi is unstable, and he will be giving a presentation on the data federation and preservation in food composition data. And Karel is founder and managing partner of Premotech from Switzerland. After the presentations, we'll go into the interactive session on long-term data preservation recommendations, so the recommendations produced by our task force. We're only looking into a selection of the recommendations because there are many, and we're going to do a poll and gathering comments and just have a discussion. Some housekeeping rules. The conference is hybrid, so I suppose that all of the people asking questions or having comments in the room need to use a microphone. I hope there's another microphone in the room. And then also there are some participants online, so if there are questions in the chat, I'm hoping my colleagues from the task force have access, yes, to the chat, and they will monitor it and post the question to the room. So let's get started with the presentation on preservation in the context of EOSC. A little bit about the task force. So we started about 2 years ago, I think, almost 2 years ago, focusing on what long-term data preservation means in the context of EOSC. At that point in the charter, we decided to split up the group in 4 topics, one working on a shared understanding and vision, the other on mapping and promotion of the roles, responsibilities and accountability related to preservation, the mapping of the financial aspects of long-term preservation, and recommendation on the creation of a European network of trusted digital repositories. With the time moving on, we more and more went to just joint meetings with the entire task force, so no longer subgroup meetings, but just jointly working on the recommendations. So in practice, the group is just meeting once a month and working in between on the documents and the desk research. So how do we work? We do the brainstorms, the desk research for all of the groups. Then it's important to scope because we can't do everything. We're making general recommendations. We're not doing specific recommendations on, for example, long-term preservation for software. So really doing general ones. We try to integrate all of the aspects from the vision so that we're always in line with what we see preservation as. And then, of course, consultation with the wider community is very important. Before we do this, we always have to present our documents to the EOSC Association board and reviewers. But now, today is an opportunity for us to already consult on a number of the recommendations, and hopefully our recommendation paper will be published soon for wider consultation. So our timeline, like I said, we established the task force in 2021. You have an overview of the outputs we've published since then. So our first consultation was on the overview discussion paper that we did during the EOSC Symposium and also the EOSC General Assembly. We published an overview discussion paper together with a survey really specifying on how we see preservation in the context of EOSC, because there's a lot of different interpretation when it comes to long-term data preservation. There was also a response to the working paper towards a European network of fair enabling trustworthy repositories that was produced by the task force. And as you all know, there's a new call coming up in next year on establishing this network on fair enabling trustworthy digital repositories. Then we also produced a paper for the preservation conference at CERN, which took place in May, on sustainable repositories creating digital objects from a long-term fair enabling perspective. But this publication is still, this conference proceeding is still pending publication. And then now we've produced our first set of recommendations, and this is a consultation document, so it's a full set of the recommendations, and we're going to the community now to ask for more input on what they think are the priority recommendations, or whether we formulate it in the right way, whether there are things that are missing, and so on. Yeah, a little bit back on the timeline. So normally we should be able to finish around the end of the year or beginning next year. It also depends on when we can publish the consultation paper and when all of the review stuff and so on by the board is done. So, but that's our normal timeline. One of the things that we really noticed with the task force, that within the task force and also with the consultation with wider community, is that there's a wide range of assumptions and perspectives around digital preservation. Really, everyone interprets it in a different way. For some people, it's just storage and bit preservation. For other ones, it goes a lot further with full appraisal, selection, preservation actions, and so on. So this is something that we really needed to put in perspective to make it clear what we mean within the task force about preservation. And then also a task that we are doing, but still needs more work, is contextualize preservation within the wider research life cycle and across the federated context of scientific metadata services or data services, because there are many databases, data services, repositories, and so in place. There are also repositories that really take long-term preservation actions, and many of the actions that those different data services take are similar. For example, everyone needs storage. So it's not a typical long-term preservation action or a typical preservation cost. But there's also other repositories that are doing, for example, fair reviewing before deposit, whether a data set is fair. But of course, being fair at the point of deposit doesn't mean it's preserved for the long term, that it will be fair for the future. So we're trying to contextualize, okay, what parts are really preservation actions and what are the other data service actions that are also part of preservation repositories. So trust and fair are the combination word for the task force. Trustworthy digital repositories cover transparency, responsibility, sustainability, and technology. And for the task force, the transparency part is really important. There can be many types of data services and metadata services around. The important thing is that they are transparent to say how they're managing, maintaining, and being sustainable in the future. So this transparency is the major point for the task force. Then, of course, digital objects with a high potential for reuse are represented by the FAIR principles. But the FAIR principles are not explicit when it comes to making it explicit that it needs to remain fair for 10 years, 50 years, and so on. So at the point of deposit, data might be fair, but if it's not taken care of in a proper way, it might not be fair anymore in 10 years, and so on. So fair enabling repositories can ensure that digital objects remain fair over time through preservation. And you've already seen this FAIR picture in combination with the core trust seal requirements yesterday in one of the other presentations in the main room. So our research and recommendations, so the EOSC is made up of a wide range of services, directly or indirectly handling data or metadata. Some don't identify themselves as repositories, and also not all repositories provide active preservation. They might just be a point of deposit and no longer take care of the objects, and also are transparent about it. So that task force has identified a broader range of metadata services in the ecosystem that is necessary to deliver the EOSC. Levels of care, so assumptions and interpretation of what constitutes preservation vary, and the task force has identified that transparency defining the service tiers offered by these different services is the most important part to be done, the most important action to be done. These range from simply providing access to the retained digital objects to services having full preservation over the long term. Our recommendations are formulated in a way that they're time independent, so that it's not like they will no longer be relevant next year, but that any kind of data service or preservation service can take this up and put the recommendations next to their actions that they're taking to see how far they are in line with the task force recommendations. And also they're generally applicable, so like I said, not related to specific software preservation, but generally to preservation of all kinds of digital objects, meant to influence policies and to provide guidance for these services. I will skip this for later. I think, unless Hervé, you want to add something now, we can go to Karel's presentation, so I will stop the sharing and he can take over.
Good morning, Roxanne. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to present you how we're a small community and how we do the data preservation in food composition. Let me go in full screen mode. Apologies, first of all, not being in the room. I'm just 3 floors higher than you, and just sitting here in the room, and had a positive COVID test yesterday, so I think it's safer when I stay here in the hotel room. Let me go ahead. Maybe first, let me explain quickly what is food composition data, that you know what I'm talking about. So if you go to the food market and buy a product, you see here on the right side, normally on the package, you have this label, and it tells you about how many calories is in the food, how many fat, sodium, and so on. And basically, this is food composition data. So this information about which nutrients and how much of the nutrients are basically in the food. Here also I show you an example. So you're getting for an apple, for instance, we also need this information, right? How much is in there? And so how the researchers get to this data? So basically from the left side, they have publications, they producing themselves or they produce in a laboratory, they analyze some foods and they're getting different results. And with the time you have more and more, and they need to select then the right one for the publication. So it could be an average, it could be a selection of certain ones, so that you only have one protein value, not the 20 or 40 different ones which exist. Sometimes you even don't have data because this analysis is quite expensive, and so they borrow values from other foods which are very similar. So you see here the pear, the fat value is there, and we borrow this into the apple. By the way, this is the only example where you can compare apple and pears because they are in food science, they are very similar, and so borrowing data from each other makes very much sense. So that's kind of funny story when other scientists speak about not comparing apple and pears. The food scientists can basically do this. So once you have all this data and you publish it, life goes on, right? Climate is changing, environment is changing. So if you collected this data for 1 year, let's say for 2022, there will be new publications, new lab reports, you have new protein values, you have to collect this data again, and you have for this year maybe a new data version for 2023, and you see kind of the value increased by 0.1 grams. All these data versions, basically we need to preserve for long-term storage, because there can be some long-term studies. How did the protein in apple change over time in the last 20 years or even more? And you want to observe this, so we need to store all these versions of data. And think about this process you're doing for thousands of foods and thousands of nutrients. So databases, yeah, it's quite a huge one. Of course, not going into terabytes, but several gigabytes, and over the years growing more and more. The community. So how is this data? So each country in Europe is obliged to publish this data. So all the governments, they have to provide this data because that's kind of public information. The researchers need it. You know, the industry needs the data because they have to put it on the label. So they need to have some of this data. So basically each country in Europe, I'm not sure if I put all the dots right, so somewhere I stopped. Apologies for this one, but each country has a national food composition database, should be publicly available, and the public researchers and industry can get the data from there. What we realized then, of course, the countries, or the data at least, is very, very similar. So we should kind of maybe join forces. A lot of borrowing happens, so this analysis is very expensive. So you borrow very often from your neighboring countries some of the data, because you say we're anyway importing some of the fruits or vegetables, so we can basically also take over your data. And then a trial to find a European common food composition database was quickly skipped because nobody wanted, because there are often country-specific data and procedures how to collect the data. So it was, decided for a distributed system. So the organizational solution was basically, let's build Eurofear ISBL, a non-profit organization in Europe, where all these countries and compiler organizations are members. And we exchange with each other, so that we are kind of having a common understanding and so on. So this Eurofear ISBL then basically started in 2009, so some years ago. And what they did is, first of all, they defined a common thesaurus. So we have controlled vocabularies that we're using. What is a nutrient? What is a food exactly? What is a unit, and which one to use? And you see here an example of the acquisition type, so where is the data coming from, but also the component thesaurus, which is the nutrient. What is a protein, a plant protein or animal protein, and you see the different versions. So we have an online system kind of to manage the thesaurus for the community. Data exchange formats was defined. So whenever you exchange data between the countries, you should do it in a certain format that we understand each other. So we have an extensive exchange format. 2009 it was, or 2006 even, the first approach started. It was XML time, right? At this time we said, okay, looks like XML is the way to go. In the meantime, we produce an Excel file because that's for the user a little bit easier. But yeah, we should come to JSON and web services. We're working on it, so we're not perfectly there yet. We also organize discussion groups on specific topics that the users can talk to each other. This was a very interesting, what we're doing is evaluation visits. So one organization is going to visit the other organizations and doing an evaluation. So how they do compilation, how they do data management, how they do data preservation. And make a report about it and gives it to the visiting organizations. This is quite interesting because some of organizations like it. So you see how important your work is, right? Somebody's coming and making an evaluation for you. But of course, if you're getting criticized in some points, there was some disagreement. It's a little bit of a balance. You have to be very political correct, let's say, if you visit and assess another organization in another country, basically. But it's quite interesting because the community is much more working together. If you visit somebody and inspect basically the details, how do you preservation exactly? What does it mean? The community also created a quality index for the data to assess the data. How good is the quality of the data? This is also very, very interesting to see reliability. Standard operation procedure, how you should do something. So how should data be backed, how to curate the data. We have there some standard operation procedures in place, which is a kind of a recommendation for all the things. And also all the data we're kind of having in a central place for European projects, which is also then stored there. Just an example of this data quality index. So we also tried to visualize this data quality of the different systems, and you see here we came up with this graph, which is more or less like a certificate in school. So for each aspect, if there is the provenance properly documented, is the food correctly described for each of these aspects, we check in each data point, and so the more green, the better your data is, the more red, your data quality is not at the best level, let's say, right? And then you're rating each aspect, and then you can weight together aspects to a total quality, and then again and again, and at the end you see the total data quality, and this looks quite good, but it's a test data set. In reality, they're not that good, but just to visualize, I was just bring this example, maybe also for data preservation, could be interesting, try to somehow visualize how good is data preserved over time in a visual way. Let's come to the long-term data preservation, to this topic. So you see this community, I'm helping several countries in data preservation with our system, so that's why I have deep insight basically how this goes, and it should also be not a secret, because we can openly speak about, because we're kind of this open community. So first of all, many of them use relational database management systems. Have you see there a long way to go? So 2006, 2009, it was very common to use relational database. Still is, even if there are some others and paradigms, it's still kind of a good way to store. Some of the countries still using Excel files, which is kind of tricky and difficult, but the community is good in place to convince them more and more. So what also helps in data preservation is, of course, the data model. So we define it, first of all, for exchanging data, but of course, it's also a guideline. If you store your data yourself, then also use this model already, right? Because it's an entity, your entity relation diagram model, you can use it. So we have also the metadata there that you should basically use, and we call this value documentation. And so you should document how the food sampling took place, how was it analyzed in the laboratory, how you aggregated, how old is the data, and all such metadata basically we're having there, defining, and hopefully that the countries are using them. We also have metadata about the data set, who produced it, who is a contact person, when was it put together, all in a data set, and so on. We're also advise the community there to use a data classification and data description system. So we started quite early, right, long time ago. So at that time it was Langwall. It's now being replaced by FoodX2, and out of the Langwall was now the food-on ontology created. So there is also kind of an ontology in place to describe the food. What is also kind of nice is, of course, that in some of the systems, they're using the same tables to store the data, the information, the versions. So the old foods and the new foods, they're stored in the same tables. And so if new attributes are added to the table, also the old foods getting this attribute. So a little bit kind of keeping this preservation, right? Keeping this old data up to date is a way that you store them in the same table. So just one of the let's say, a solution that some of the countries are using. When it comes to the thesaurize, if you're using the thesaurize, right, and for instance, you have here in the version last year, 2022, I used the Nucci thesaurize version 1.2, and this year I'm using the 1.4. We're documenting, some of the system documented like this, so that we know exactly which version was used, but they don't go back and say, okay, also update the version 22 of the data with the thesaurus version 1.4. So we don't do this work afterwards, right? Because yeah, you have to go through and have 20 years of data, need to update them all. Manually work at the moment. They don't do this. So here probably preservation is not perfectly done, let's say it, but at least it's documented how it's done, right? And yeah, just as a comment, all these databases on the countries we consider as trustworthy, right? So this community is meeting on a regular basis, online systems or a physical meeting once a year even, and we're considered this as trustworthy repositories. So just given by the fact that they participate in the community, so the Trust Core Seal, for instance, we're not considered yet. We know about it, but we did not consider yet to kind of apply for it, because that's kind of a community which is long there and running and considered as trustworthy, right? Because we also have these procedures and standards that the community is following, basically. But that's it. Just a small example from the full composition world.
Thank you, Karel. Perhaps if there are questions now related to the presentation, otherwise we go to the recommendations and the interactive part. Okay, let's share my screen again. Okay, so like I said, during the symposium, we're just focusing on a subset of recommendations. We'll see how far we get with the time we have. If it's only one, we do fine. But of course, once our document is published, we will provide a feedback template on which you can provide comments and feedback on all of the recommendations. Perhaps also important to say is that the document is also combined with assumptions, so it always gives explanation of what we're concretely meaning with all of our recommendations, because we notice that otherwise a lot of times the information is interpreted in a different way than it was intended. So the poll is first a response option, so I'm going to show some of the recommendations. You will first have an option to agree, partially agree, or disagree. And then the second part will be the possibility to leave a comment that we can then use for discussion. So you can go to pollf.com/RoxanneWins154. And this one, once I activate the Slidos, and not Slidos, but Poll Everywhere, you will be able to answer. Okay. So if everything goes well.
Could you just go back to the link?
Okay. And sorry for that. This one. No. Yeah, here's the QR. Okay, at least one person responded. So the recommendation is data services, including repositories, should specify all levels of care they apply to objects within their collection, including through registry metadata. So this is very much about this transparency, about what kind of activities they're doing to make sure the data is fair and is preserved for the future.
The time was very short, so it took like 15 seconds and the option disappeared.
And why did it just jump to another screen? Yeah, otherwise we'll just do it. Yeah, and there's a problem. I don't know who's using the Wi-Fi, but it's just not loading with the Wi-Fi. That's why I'm using my own hotspot. So I'll suggest that we leave it at this, and that we just go over to discussing this in the room. No, some people managed. Okay. Does someone want to react to this recommendation that all repositories, whatever type of repository it is, whether they're just doing deposits and no longer taking care of the objects, or doing more actions, whether they should be very explicit on their portals, on their platforms, to say what kind of care they're taking for digital objects? Is it something, there's some partial agreements, perhaps we can go into that, why partially? Is it a formulation, is it because you do not think that repositories should be explicit in what kind of care they're taking for objects? Anyone wants to react? No? Okay.
It depends on how much work you are able to do and how much resources you can put in that. So if you want to go simple, and then you have to be very restrictive, and your coverage for the variety of objects will be limited. But if you want to be very flexible, for example, there are some repositories like Federated EGA, they have some flexibility in the design of the schema, and this can be considered as flexibility for digital objects. But it all depends on how much resources and how much support and how much manpower do you have, and of course technical experience as a repository.
Thanks. So this is a typical issue we have often when we speak about data standards and providing, not really for storing the data, but for providing information on the collections to third parties. So we have, in the Biodiversity Information Standard Group, I have very nice standards with all kinds of data and metadata that they would like to know, including the care of collections and so on. But typically when we want to provide the data, most of these fields, although we want them remain empty, because they are not in the original database where we collect the data. So we developed all these fancy tools to connect automatically. But if in the original data the information is not recorded, and you have to go back to your collection and to your objects and ask somebody, when you have 40 million specimens, to add this back manually into the database, even it's very interesting, you simply can't do it. And then you do it for a small part of the collections because you happen to have a project on this part of the collection, but unless you get IA that goes into the collections and somehow can, with robots, record it automatically in some way, maybe we get progress, but as long as you rely on people and volunteers, we help with citizen science, but still, even if they have to go back to the handwritten logs and books to find this information or old papers, it still takes a lot of time, even if you work with volunteers to capture this information. So it's not that we don't want to make it open, but we simply don't have the people to add it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of why we end up with this kind of a categorization problem, yeah? And what we've been pushing for here is to say, if you are a repository that claims to offer a service, how could you develop a typology of services? Not that everything needs to be preserved for the long term, but it should be clear to the depositors and to the users what level of basic care is being undertaken. But you raised two really important points there. One is compliance on deposit is quite often out of the repository's control. That's a slightly separate issue, which is documenting the level of compliance or the level of absence of compliance over time. But one thing that you'll have heard multiple times over the last few days, for a slightly separate area of this topic, is, well, of course, making things fair retrospectively is incredibly expensive and difficult. Everything must be fair by design. But there's a hell of a lot of stuff out there already. So I think there is a quantifiable difference between you offering a particular level of service, either a deposit level or a long-term preservation level of service, and this slightly different case where we're all trying to find the periodic resources to do the kind of uplift to the data and metadata that we know needs to be done. I think that sits slightly to one side of our service offering, but it's also something which is not very easy to write into a sexy request for a project, yeah? But that underlying tedious uplift of these resources to make them fair and to make them accessible and to improve their quality is another part of the long tail of data that outside of the service levels that the EOSC is really going to depend upon if it's not going to have an inaccessible pool of data as well. So I think that uplift aspect is another really important one.
Okay. So the second recommendation that we picked out for today is digital objects should include metadata that specify their level of care and the time phrase or criteria for reappraisal of the level of care. And this is a bit in line with what Patricia is saying, that yeah, we want to, but in the original data it's sometimes missing and it takes a lot of resources to edit. Someone wants to give a comment, reaction to this, and I think it's important to say that we're looking for progress, not perfection. It's also what Karel mentioned in his presentation. They're doing their best is the intention, and being transparent on what kind of actions you're taking, but not like expecting that everything is perfect. But these are the kind of recommendations to work towards, and not to having perfection. Someone wants to react? Sally?
I'm just wondering whether we can have a bit like the linked open data stars, so some sort of gradation or something, so that people can step by step work towards it and actually see the outcomes. So they could get up to level of care 2 or 3 from 5 or something like that. They would need to be defined and implemented, I realise, but some way to sort of be able to track the improvement over time, maybe.
Yes, that's a really important factor. So we've adopted the levels from the Core Trust Seal, which is a draft discussion paper which is out there with multiple tiers of, and they're just levels, yeah? What's kind of a missing ingredient for EOSC is the turning that levels into a service offering, yeah? And while you work up through those levels and they are increasing, not everything is going to be appraised as needing long-term preservation. So I'd be careful about doing the levels in a way that say, well, if you're not doing long-term preservation, you're wasting your time. Sometimes you've got very stable formats, very stable data. It just needs to be looked after. And knowing that is part of the point here, yeah? As long as it's transparently known that it's not being long-term preserved and why, that is one of the important factors. But to talk about what you're doing is also breaking down those services into local circumstances, which are so, as we know, so enormously complicated that, so we haven't got an agreed set of levels at the moment. If we can agree that, then we can develop the metadata for the transparency. I can see maybe data management plans being a location where the more detailed service offering could be placed. And in terms of that, what is the minimal offering for this data that you might negotiate as a researcher, but you might include in a data management plan what you'd consider to be the target care in the future as well. Because not everyone is going to agree on that appraisal. I think I've made that sound about as complicated as it actually is.
Okay. Someone else wants to react?
So I know you had mentioned Core Trust Seal a lot, but just to highlight from the life sciences side and Elixir, for our biodatabases, we have the Elixir Core Data Resources kind of seal of approval. So it's a kind of community-based standard, and that kind of reassures life scientists that for deposition, we have our Elixir EDD's deposition databases where we recommend to life scientists where to go, but also our core data resources, which again, fundamental to the life scientists. If this data disappeared tomorrow, that it would be detrimental to life scientists all around, and then they can flag that to funders to help secure funding. But what is the incentive for Core Trust Seal if this is the model that's going to help secure long-term funding to sustain the databases? Because I know it's an added standard as well, or kind of seal of approval, which I understand trust is very important, but how does that help? Are the funders looking at this as well, and is that helping them secure funding, or are there any cases as well that this is in a more generalist sense or in other domains, examples?
I'll first react from my own perspective. So we as a university, we're also preparing for Core Trust Seal. Even if we do not get the certificate, because certain conditions might not be able to meet, we still think it's a relevant exercise because it obliges you to think about, okay, what is your governance structure, what is your sustainability, what kind of actions do you take to take proper care of the data. Appraisal and selection also to make sure that not all data needs to be kept. So I still think that for putting all of the documentation and the procedures in place, it's a very relevant exercise whether we get the Core Trust Seal or not. Because for an institution or a repository, having a Core Trust Seal is not so important. We don't have this problem of sustainability or needing funding, of course. So that's my perspective from the institutional, but I'll give it to Hervé for the other one.
Remind me, does the Elixir core databases, does that define different tiers of care? I don't think it does.
So we've kind of 5 main tiers that we assess, everything from usage metrics to community and standards and technical operations.
Yeah.
But it doesn't exactly look at the trust aspect in a thorough.
Yeah, and this is I mean, to be clear, this is less about the trust piece and more about what when you hand over your data, you can expect the level of care to be eventually. And I don't think it's there in that. I think it's emerging out of Core Trust Seal, which is where this discussion paper has come from, but it's not solely applicable to Core Trust Seal. Kind of to reflect on Roxanne's point, the Core Trust Seal stuff came out of a community of practice which was looking to develop standard practices and agreements as well. We know that it's not the only one. There's the Elixir work, there's the Coalition of Open Access Repositories have got criteria as well. What we've actually looked at the moment is something that we're putting together through the UK Data Service, which is feeding into CESDA as well, which is looking at a mapping across the multiple functions and activities. Yeah, that's included the Elixir work as well. It's added some things which I think are relevant to metadata and data services. They're not maybe critical for certification. Business information management might be an example. Yeah. That you need to have to manage your evidence, but it's not a certification topic. But still, the reason you'll hear Core Trust Seal mentioned is that most of these map strongly to Core Trust Seal. Yeah? But Core Trust Seal will cover active preservation. Yeah? So we've got a massive range of very effective, very high-performant data and metadata services across the EOSC who wouldn't necessarily qualify for Core Trust Seal. So one of the things that we've got here is that It's not all about preservation, but what are the other levels? It's not all about trustworthy digital repositories, but what are the other services? We'll share the paper afterwards. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on the mapping that's come out of that.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Is that?
Yeah, no, it's super useful. And just one other thing to highlight that wasn't touched upon yet, but has fair sharing been looked into in this context for database standards? It's kind of a registry where, for example, if you have your own database and it's domain agnostic, that you can register your database, have a record of it online, and you can also look into other
both
databases.
Fair sharing and read-through data are being looked at in terms of kind of repository, like metadata schemas. We've got the linkage across the standards pieces, and that's one of the things that maybe this could feed into. If we can agree the curation levels, they're just simple statements, but the level to which we can go in terms of machine actionability of sharing that information is kind of a next step that we could see being out there. Because if we could share that level of care in something like fair sharing or in read-through data, it just provides like quite a useful extra filter. And then the next stage after that is obviously effectively connecting those fair digital objects to the metadata about the repositories that they're held in. And that starts to give you kind of some of those real linked data opportunities.
Fantastic.
Perhaps we can try one more, and then I think... okay. So another recommendation, I think we have 68 or something, so... It's fair enabling practices undertaken by data services should be made transparent to users and funders to increase trust in services. So this is again, and there are many of the aspects related to transparency, and it's also not necessarily on the metadata level, but the amount of times I went to repositories and really had to dig into the terms of use and so on to know what would happen with my data, how sustainable the repository initiative was, and so on. What would happen with my data if it was no longer maintained, what would be the procedures, and so on. This is, you always as a researcher need to dig deep to find this, and this is about making this more transparent immediately when researchers and also funders get there, and it also relates to you, and Core Trust Seal is one certification, but if you just make transparent to the Elixir users and the funders that these are the levels of care we're taking. So that's what this requirement is about. Does someone wants to comment?
Thank you. Hi. So I was the partially agree, and I feel like I need to explain myself now as I'm 7% of the room. But so I work at DANS, and DANS is part of CESDA, and a colleague and I co-wrote the chapter on fair enabling organizations in their data archiving guide. And part of that was surveying the different CESDA members to be like, so what do you do to enable and promote FAIR to your user, your designated community? And we found that quite a few, it kind of split halfway, where some like DANS are very like, we're gonna talk about FAIR all the time, we're gonna make it really clear, we're gonna share it with all of our designated communities so that they know about it and they know why it's important. Whereas a few other archives were more like, we really want to decrease we want to make it as simple as possible for our users to use the archiving service, and we don't want to overburden them with information if they want it, but we want them to know that when they use our archive or use our repository, they're going to be making their data fair. So when I see transparent, I guess it's also in the realm of advocacy or just making it apparent. So making it transparent to users, like in the terms and conditions or preservation policies are very important, but also going into the realm of how important is it to talk to your designated community about FAIR. It really does vary by archive based on their capacity.
Yes, and that's part of the actions that you take to make data more fair, and indeed resources are needed to be able to do that.
Yeah, we struggle with the visibility thing. I mean, one of the problems we've had for this whole thing is that maybe archives have been a very small, effective community of people doing an amazing job for a really long time. And maybe we've been talking to each other too much and not making it clear what we do. That's one of these transparency pieces is users and funders. Yeah, it's not necessarily just your end users, but do the funders understand kind of what your unique value proposition is for why it's being kept here rather than somewhere else. The transparency thing is about having the information available, and ideally generally available, not just buried in a core trust seal process, but something that you can expose as a repository in general. But yeah, I do completely take the point that managing what the end user has to digest and not imagining that every bit of archival geekiness that I find fascinating is necessarily what they're looking for when they arrive at a resource discovery system. But I think that's more of a user experience thing. I think having the information there, as Roxanne said, going through the process is always valuable to the organization, managing the information and having it. But you're right, there is another level of kind of how much we promote that. And that's the difference between, well, here's the results of my fair test in detail versus here's my badge. Yeah. But the badging is a whole other discussion because a badge can hide a whole host of successes and failures as well. You know, somebody who's doing the very best they can with their data against the odds might score low, and someone who's just got a badge, despite their enormous resources, might not actually be doing that well. So there's a real balance about how we communicate that. And I think that trust and fair, how we manage that journey and make sure that the transparency is an opportunity for, you know, sharing and mindset growth and progress and not for dismissal and judgment. You know, how we balance those out is going to be a real part of how we go beyond the technical piece into the kind of cultural piece of trust and fair.
I think we need to start wrapping up unless there's still a quick question or comment. No. Okay, I thank you very much for your participation. We hope to get our recommendations for consultation published very soon. We will be doing webinars. If you're interested with your community to for an organized webinar. We did one for EOSC Ireland, for example. They asked us to give a presentation on the work we are doing and go through the recommendations. So we're happy to set this up for specific groups, but we're also trying to organize some of the webinars for everyone who wants to attend. And then, of course, there will be this template available for commenting the requirements. Don't feel obliged to comment on all of them. Comment only on the ones you think are important. That would be much appreciated because we want to make this into a community driven and accepted document. So thank you very much.